Good morning and welcome back to NASA's Johnson Space Center for today's mission status briefing. This is the Flight Day 7 of the STS-134 Space Shuttle mission to the International Space Station, and the crew members just completed the second spacewalk of the flight. So we have an update from the lead Space Station Flight Director for the mission, Derek Hausman, and the lead spacewalk officer for the flight as well, Allison Bollinger. So we'll start out with the opening comments and then take questions.
Hey, thanks, Kylie, and good morning, everybody. It's great to be here this morning after what was a very long but very successful and very rewarding day in mission control. It's great to have our second spacewalk, EVA2, behind us, and I'm going to leave the details to Allison to talk about, but I will say that all of the planned tasks for the EVA were completed successfully, and I was very happy with the way both the on-orbit crew as well as the ground teams performed today. We talked yesterday and during the pre-flight briefings about EVA2 being the most challenging spacewalk that we were going to execute on this mission. And in particular, I talked about the ammonia quick disconnects that we were going to have to touch on this EVA in order to do the refill of the photovoltaic TCS thermal control system. And ironically enough, that part of the spacewalk was absolutely flawless. The QDs performed exactly as they expected, or as they were supposed to, not as we expected them to. The actual amount of ammonia that we moved from the permanent external thermal control system to the photovoltaic thermal cooling loop was spot on in terms of the pre-flight analysis. The choreography between the ground teams and the Thor console in particular and the crew on orbit was just as we planned. So that part of the spacewalk, really, you could not have expected it to go on any better. What surprised us today, and which Allison will talk about in more detail, was some issues we had with the bolt associated with the solar alpha rotary joint covers that we had to remove to do the lubrication. But we were able to pretty quickly in real time work around those problems. It did slow us down a little bit, but we were able to perform all the lubrication tasks on the Sarge. And it was an indication and a demonstration of all the training that goes into these missions and all the preparations that allowed us to respond very effectively in real time to those surprises. The EVA did run long, but consumables were never an issue today. Drew and Spanky's metabolic rates were both very low, so we had plenty of margin both on oxygen as well as the carbon dioxide scrubbing consumables. Really, it was just a matter of the crew day running long, and we did decide to press, and in the end completed all the tasks very successfully. And one of the things that kind of happened in the background, but nonetheless was a key piece of this, was the robotic support that the crew provided, specifically for the Dexter latching end effector lubrication task. You know, with everything else going on, it seemed like that was in the background, but that was a relatively complex choreography between Greg Johnson on the controls of the station robotic arm and Drew Feustel in order to finish that lubrication. So overall, a very, very successful day. I'm very proud of the teams on the ground as well as the crew on orbit. And with that, I'll hand over to Allison.
All right, thanks a lot, Derek. As Derek mentioned, it was a long one today, a PET of 8:07, but I couldn't be more proud of the way things turned out in the end. So let's see, we started out the EVA with heading back outboard to the port Sarge, where we rerouted the P3, P4 jumper to help set up the pipeline, the one that we had temp stowed at the end of EVA1. Once we were complete with that task, Mike headed inboard to the P1 ATA panel, where he worked on relocating a jumper that's currently in the vent location from the ammonia tank out to the fill location. Once he got that complete, we coordinated with folks on the ground to go ahead and start an initial leak check, which verified that we had good ammonia flowing from the ammonia tank assembly all the way out to the double ETCS system. At that point in time, once we verified we had a good leak check, and that was a fairly quick leak check to realize we had a rock-solid system, which was a definite relief in the front room for all of us, we gave Drew a go to start picking up on his steps. So he then manipulated a quick disconnect that allowed the ammonia to flow from the ammonia tank through part of the pipeline out to the double ETCS system. We sat there for a few minutes and let it stabilize to verify that pressures were indeed still good. And once we were complete with that, we gave Drew the final go to throw the final few QDs at out on the end of P6. Once he threw those QDs, it took about 10 minutes to perform the fill, and as Derek mentioned, we couldn't be more pleased with how it turned out. We were able to get right on the pre-flight numbers for that fill. So while that fill was ongoing, Drew worked on setting up the vent tools that he would use to perform those ammonia vents. Meanwhile, Mike was quietly working along on getting set up to release those sarge covers to perform the sarge lubrication. Our plan was to release 6 covers, 3 pairs of covers. We've had some history of issues with these bolts in the past, but we thought we had worked through it, and we discussed all the different training options in order to release these bolts successfully. But Mike started working on covers 16 and 17, and before we knew it, we started having issues with bolts. And so in the end, we ended up with cover 17, 3 of its 4 bolts that are captive, should be captive to the cover. We ended up, those bolts came uncaptive, and Mike was able to stow those in his trash bag, which all crew members carry with them. And then on cover 16, we lost 1 of those 4 bolts, and that one was actually, we lost that overboard. So I do have a sarge cover here to show. So I'm looking at this area right here to see when we're talking about these bolts. So we've got this is an example of a double cover. We have single covers and double covers. So this is a double cover that has a total of 6 bolts. So the bolt you can see has a spring fastener on it, and then on the back side, it has just a little washer, and that's what helps keep the bolt captive. So we believe it was damage to these washers. So when Mike was releasing these, if these washers aren't engaged, the bolt is essentially spring-loaded to pop off the cover. So luckily, Mike was able to catch 3 of those 4 released bolts. So that was good. So that then caused a lot of discussion on the ground about how do we proceed with releasing these covers. Do we attempt to release the remaining 4 covers that we still had to release? And we ended up deciding that out of the 4 covers we had remaining, we would release just 1 from each of those pairs and press with doing the lubrication just under those covers. And Mike did report as he was releasing those, the 2 remaining covers that we gave him a go to release, that he had no issue. The bolts felt nice, and then he didn't have any problem with releasing those covers. So we did not lose any other bolts for the remainder of the EVA. So while Mike was working along with removing those covers and performing the lubrication, once we were complete with the fill, per the procedure, we were supposed to initially do our long 17-minute ammonia vent, which does not have an eclipse constraint, but our shorter vent, the vent of the smaller EAS jumpers, which run out on P6, that does have an eclipse constraint. So we were looking at the day-night cycles and calculating that on the ground, and we realized it would be best to go ahead and flip the order of those vents and do the short vent first to put ourselves in a better posture. The crew had trained this, and we've trained this in the Neutral Buoyancy Lab, and we've discussed this before, so this was the right choice. We were able to voice the words up to the crew to go ahead and swap the order of the vents, and it was no issue. So Drew headed outboard with the vent tools and set up for the 3.5-minute ammonia vent. Once he was complete with that, he rerouted the vent tool line inboard and then set up for the longer 17-minute vent, which involved some coordination with Greg Chamatov, who was the task IV for today. It was during that 17-minute vent we were able to see some downlink footage that there was quite a bit of ammonia, as expected, ammonia crystals coming out of the nozzle of the vent tool, and Drew was a good 10 to 15 feet away from this area. And he reported that, a couple crystals kind of came in his general direction. He was making his way inboard to get away from that nozzle. And it was at that point in time that we declared that he had suspected contamination, which per our flight rules, which dictate how we run things, just said that when he's in the vicinity of ammonia, we have to protect consumables to go ahead and do a contamination test at the end of the EVA. So with that call, the crew members they continued on with the Sarge lube. And once we were complete with the longer vent, Drew worked on stowing the vent tool extender back in its bag that it came out, and Mike worked on stowing the P3, P4 jumper back in its location on the bulkhead where we found it at the beginning of EVA1. We cleaned up the work site, verified that the Sarge was ready for rotation, and both crew members headed inboard. And it was at that time we started working on the ground with the Falcon flight controller to go ahead and start rotating the Sarge. Let's see, Drew headed off to reconfigure the home plate back by the ammonia tank assembly to allow it back into its vent location for contingency operations. And then Drew worked with Box who was flying the SSRMS with Dexter on the end of it to install a lens cover on the CLA camera on the end effector, and also to use the straight nozzle grease gun to apply a coat of grease to the snares on the inside of the latching end effector. While that was going on, Spanky was able to successfully install the 2 grapple bar stowage beams out on the starboard side of the truss. When we were complete with that task and the Sarge was complete with its rotation, both crew members headed outboard, and we had quite a bit of discussions on the ground, but we felt it was the best course of action to continue on with the way we had things written in the timeline. So both crew members worked together to perform the lubrication under those the 4 covers that we had removed, and then they worked together to reinstall 3 of the 4 covers, and we opted, since cover 17 only had 1 of its 4 bolts, we require at least 2 bolts to be installed. We opted to bring that cover inside so that we can look at it IVA and see if there's a way that we can rig up the bolts that were brought inside in the trash bag to possibly install this cover either possibly in our EVAs or in a future EVA. As all these tasks were ongoing, we were continuing to run what we call ammonia bakeout calculators in the background, which basically tell us we need to protect 15 minutes to have the crew members isolated inside the airlock at the end of the EVA once we have an ammonia contamination incident, to ensure that all of the ammonia has sublimated off the crew members. So we performed the visual inspection to verify there was no ammonia present on Drew, and then we continued to run that calculator in the background. And like I said, 15 minutes is a requirement, and we had about an hour and a half equivalent time of that airlock bakeout. So we decided, after much discussion on the ground between the flight director and the surgeon, that the right course of action was to opt not to do the decontamination test at the end of the EVA, and we were all confident that that was the right answer. So when we voiced those words up to the crew, that they could stand down from performing that contamination test at the end of the EVA. So once the crew was complete with the Sarge cover install, they packed up the bags and they headed back to the airlock, and then we ingressed and closed the hatch, like I said, on an 8-hour and 7-minute EVA. That's all I have.
Great. So with that, we'll start taking questions here at the Johnson Space Center, and we'll try to wrap it up in about 10 minutes so we can send it back to Mission Control for the change of command ceremony, and we'll also go to the phone bridge. But go ahead with your first question. Go ahead.
Philip Sloss with NASAspaceflight.com for Allison. What's the plan for cover 17, and is there any issue with leaving it off indefinitely?
So we have a pre-flight analysis that says we are good to leave. Actually, it was all 6 covers. We are good to leave those covers off between EVAs 2 and 4. And we only did the analysis for the docked mission. So I'm sure they're looking at the possibility of leaving that cover off indefinitely. And we're still discussing how we're going to handle the workaround with that cover.
Mark Carreau, Aviation Week, I think for Derek. Do you know how often you plan to lubricate the Sarge joints? Is there a sort of schedule that you like to follow?
You can probably answer that one better than me.
I think currently they're recommending every 5 years we should relubricate the joint.
We were a little early on this one.
Yes,
right?
we were only about 2.5, almost 3 years on this lube.
Gina Sinceri, ABC News. You talked about the fact that they kept their metabolic rates low. I mean, is that something you train them to do? Or, I mean, because I would think Mike Fincke was in a pretty stressful situation. He was coping with it the best way that he could, but his metabolic rate still stayed low, so I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, and I think it's all about just your body and how your body handles stress. We do train the crew to, not fight the suit. And they learn these things in the neutral buoyancy lab to try to, to try to understand that you don't need a death grip out in space. When you're translating on handrails, you just need fingertip touch. And so I think Spanky or Mike Fincke, definitely knows how to operate in a suit since he has so much experience in the Russian suit. So I think that just combined with their bodies, allows them both to have lower MET rates.
Robert Perlman with CollectSpace.com and Space.com. Looking ahead to EVA3, do you have a plan for picking up the work that was left over from EVA1, or how that's going to play out? Thanks.
I'll take that one too.
Sure.
Okay. EVA3, tentatively right now, we are looking at adding the tasks that we weren't able to complete on EVA1 into approximately the middle of EVA3. We're still working out the plans about what tasks are actually going to fall off, but that we are working that.
We have another question here. Okay. We'll go to the phone bridge next. Bill Harwood, please.
Yeah, thanks. For Allison, I was wondering what happened to the washers associated with those bolts that came loose. It sounded like they were captive within the panel, but I wasn't sure. And just for the record, just making sure there wasn't any issue of debris getting inside the Sarge at all. Thanks.
Yeah, and I'm not quite sure. In order for the bolt to release, the washer would have to be released from the bolt in order for the bolt to come out the front side of the cover. Mike did report seeing one of those washers and kind of hovering between the cover and the Sarge area, and so we directed him to he ended up using a tool to kind of scoot that washer out of the area. We didn't hear any reports on the other washers that we lost. So I'll be curious to see when they empty their trash bags tonight, what they actually have inside of them.
Thanks.
And Marcia Dunn, please.
Yes, hi. Again, for Allison, the two covers that you weren't able to remove, when are you going to get around to lubricating under those two areas?
I think we're still assessing the plan right now. I think definitely not during this mission. They're going to evaluate if the lubrication that we applied under these 4 covers is sufficient to count as a relube. So those discussions are ongoing right now.
I just wanted to clarify. So did Mike Fincke indeed, was he able to scoot that washer out of the area? Because I was listening and I really didn't hear him really follow up on that.
You're right. We gave him the instructions to use a gentle backhand sweeping motion to get the washer out of the way, and he said he would try to use a pip pin on the end of his tether. But yeah, we did not hear. We didn't have a video at the time, and we also didn't hear if he completed it. But I would trust that he understands how sensitive that Sarge hardware is, so he would do everything in his power in order to ensure that the washer would not get tangled in the Sarge.
Thank you.
And next on the line is James Dean.
Hi, thank you, James Dean with Florida Today. I just had a couple questions. First, I just wondered if, I guess that bolt was seen by the crew pretty easily, and just wondered, is that something that can be actually tracked, or is it too small, or is it kind of known where that is and where it's going? And then secondly, I just wanted to ask you, I just want to confirm, I guess it was 4 bolts that Mike caught, and I just wondered if you could speak to, as you mentioned about working in a suit, how I would imagine very difficult it would be to catch a small screw with a bulky spacesuit glove.
And in terms of tracking the bolt, it's likely that it's small enough that it won't be tracked, but based on the report from the crew on the trajectory and the velocity, we don't expect it to be a problem.
And we did end up losing, we released a total of 4 bolts from the Sarge cover, and Spanky was able to catch 3 of those. And yeah, that's probably about the extent of what you can catch in an EMU glove, would be about a 1-inch bolt this size.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Are there any follow-ups here? We have time. No. Seeing none, then we will go back to Mission Control shortly here. The change of command ceremony is scheduled to take place at 10:31 a.m. Central Time with the station commanders. And then the crew members will wrap up their day. Flight day highlights for Flight Day 7 will begin airing at 1 p.m. Central Time. The International Space Station Flight Director update is at 5:45 p.m. And also there's an educational event following the next crew wake-up. The crew wake-up is at 7:56 p.m. and then that educational event with the Mesa Verde Elementary School in Tucson is at 9:45 p.m. this evening. So with that, we'll send it back to Mission Control, and thank you.